Good morning to everybody. I am Alessandra Venturini. I am the holder of the Jean Monnet Chair in European Migration Studies, hosted by the University of Torino and financed by the European Commission. I'm very glad that today we open one of the first satellite seminars of the chair. The name of the seminar is Consumption of Cultural Goods as Driver of Migrant Integration. The acronym is Cocumint. But we are also very glad and honored that Stephen Vertovec accepted the invitation to open this seminar. Stephen Vertovec is very well known, but given that we come from very discipline, let me introduce some of his background. He was formerly Professor of Transnational Anthropology at the University of Oxford and Director of the British Economic Social Research Council's Centre of Migration Policy and Society. He is the founding director of the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Religious and Ethnic Diversity, an honorary professor of sociology and ethnology at the University of Göttingen in Germany. Stephen is currently co-editor of the journal Global Networks, a co-editor of the Palgrave book series Global Diversity. He also has been author of many books. Just mentioned two: Transnationalism, a Diversity and Contact. He's also been editor and co-editor of many volumes. Just let me name the last one, the Oxford Handbook of Superdiversity. For over 25 years, Stephen has engaged in a range of policymakers, including the Expert Council of German Foundation on Migration and Integration, the UK government's Cabinet Office or Home Office, the European Commission, the GA, the World Bank, and UNESCO. So we are very glad that Stephen Vertovec accepted to introduce this seminar. We couldn't find any scholar more suited to our program. Stephen, the floor is yours.
Yeah, well, I'm happy and honored to be the kickoff for this series. I was just saying a little bit beforehand what an interesting line of thinking this is about diversity, culture, and the arts. And I'll say first off that I don't know anything really at all about culture and the arts except as a consumer myself, but I have nothing interesting or conceptual or analytical to say about that. We'll leave that for the other great speakers you've got lined up for the series. I agreed with Alessandra that I would simply kick off the series by talking about a couple of key concepts that you might be talking about throughout the series. And just so that this opening talk is just kind of introduction to these two key concepts, diversity and superdiversity, and what's the similarity, what's the difference, and particularly how are these used? I'm not just going to be talking about definitions, but how people actually use these terms and how they can get confused and so forth. So this is just my take on how what meanings these terms have developed. And the way that I'll kick this off is with a question that sort of sets the confusion between the terms. Just last month, I was part of a webinar series of something called UNIC, which is a consortium of 8 universities across Europe. And they had this thing about superdiversity and inclusion in higher education. And so the webinar was going along and we gave our talks, and there was really interesting discussion about how universities can prepare themselves for super diverse settings in which they exist and a more super diverse student population that's coming into the universities. But one of the questions that came from the floor was from one of the professors at one of the universities, and she said, well, why are we talking about superdiversity when we haven't even yet sorted out diversity? And she went on to point out that in her university, something like only 20% of professors were women. And this is a good question and an important question, but it underlines to me about the confusion between these two terms, as if superdiversity is just more diversity, or well, we haven't sorted out diversity, trying to create a certain kind of diverse staff population and so forth. So anyways, this is just a question that stuck in my head and can kind of guide us through this. And I'll come back to the question at the end to see whether we've answered it or not. Okay, well, obviously the word diversity is all around us. Two very current uses, the American Academy Awards, or the Oscars, which you'll probably know about, take place in a couple of weeks, and they're talked about as the most diverse Oscars yet. It's a great way of celebrating diversity. The diversity is a key thing in this year's Oscars. The same time we saw last month, as you probably picked up in the global media, about Marilyn Magal and this interview that she gave, and one of the results of that was that the Buckingham Palace and the royal family in Britain are going to be hiring a diversity expert to help them with diversity. And even the Chicago Tribune said, well, if they want a diversity czar for the royal family, they've squandered the chance to diversify by getting rid of Meghan Markle. Again, it just shows the different ways diversity is being used and talked about, but are we talking about the same thing, or what are we actually talking about when it comes to diversity? Now, you know, for at least a good 20 years now, diversity is everywhere, in universities, in government, in public sector, in the corporate sphere, in all sorts of public spheres. You have all of these kinds of programs and policies and campaigns and so forth. It's not just a kind of Anglo-American thing. Vielfalt is the word for diversity in German, and across Germany we have the same thing. Vielfalt is all over the place as badging, and I'm sure it's the same in Italy. Diversità is probably all over the place in the same way, in terms of different kinds of campaigns and programs and mission statements of organizations and so forth. This is something Time magazine, just in the United States alone, what they call the diversity industry, is worth $8 billion. This is the world of diversity consultants and diversity training programs and so forth. And actually, I've written about this over the last 50 years. Surprisingly, it's been international corporations that have been the real drivers of this word diversity, but for all sorts of reasons, which I'll come to in a minute. So diversity is a big thing. I'm sure it's the same across Italy as well. And it will be talked about a lot in this series about diversity in relation to culture and the arts. So what is meant by this term? Well, one of the first things, obviously, is diversity. We're talking about lots of difference, of social difference, however defined. Now, most discourse and programs and diversity management and all of these sorts of things focus on race or ethnicity and gender as the key modes of difference that go into diversity discourse. So most of the time in the United States, when they're talking about, you know, the Academy Awards are the most diverse ever and celebrating diversity, they're talking about race, ethnicity, and gender. But if you look at corporate and university and public sector brochures and training courses and seminars and mission statements and corporate annual reports, they talk about lots of different kinds of difference, not just race, ethnicity, and gender, but social class, religion, sexuality, mental and physical ability, nationality, and then all of these other things, perspectives, insights, backgrounds, viewpoints. Everything gets lumped into diversity. And that kind of, well, we can get into what effects that have. Does that actually kind of remove the importance of race, ethnicity, and gender, or sexuality and disability and age even, as some of the key markers of difference in diversity discourse? I just want to point this out to say that there is no fixed modes of difference that are talked about in a lot of diversity discourse. But whatever we're talking about, whatever modes of difference we're talking about, race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, disability, age are usually the foremost ones, but then you get into all these other ones. We know that all of this diversity discourse and training and so forth has something to do with the promotion or the political cause, as it were, of trying to ensure equality, fairness in a particular institution, let's say, or in something like the royal family or the Academy Awards or your university. About equality and fairness, inclusion, participation, anti-discrimination, social justice in some broad sense of doing the right thing for people. We know it has something to do with the promotion of all of these qualities, whether we're talking about, again, whatever mode of difference. So if we're talking about sexuality or disability or race, we want to make sure that there is equality, fairness, participation, anti-discrimination, social justice for people with a different mode of sexuality, disability, or whatever, as with everybody else. So there is, in what I'm moving towards here is it's not just about talking about lots of kinds of difference. When we have diversity discourse and training and so forth, we're talking about a particular kind of agenda or set of goals associated with all of these modes of difference. We want more equality, fairness, participation, anti-discrimination, and so forth. So there is this is one of the main messages I'm getting across here. There is a kind of agenda when we're talking diversity, that we want to promote these qualities of equality, anti-discrimination, and so forth. Now, given this common set of goals, however, there is a great difference in what people mean by equality and anti-discrimination and so forth. This is what I call a polysemy. Polysemy means when the same word means lots of different things, okay? And this is what's happening with diversity. So for some people, when they're calling for the promotion of diversity, they're calling for something around representation, which can either mean we want more numbers, we want more Black people, more gay people, more disabled people in our institution or our group or whatever, or we want to give those people more voice, to let their needs become more present in our university or institution or whatever it is. So that's one way people talk about diversity, is we want better numbers. We want a parliament or a university or a corporation to look more like the population outside. Okay, so that's what's meant by a lot of people by diversity and promotion of diversity. For other people, it's more about redistribution, not just more numbers, but it's about inequality, about jobs, about incomes, about being able to live in certain places and not being excluded. Okay, which you see is a different agenda from just representation. For still other people, when they're talking about diversity, they're talking about more recognition for a particular mode of difference, more dignity, a more positive image being attached to people with a particular image, whether it being, Black Lives Matter or pro-transgender or something like that. We want to recognize that these people have dignity, and it needs to be recognized in the public sphere and in the way we talk. This, you see, is yet a different agenda from redistribution and representation, but it's still used in this promotion of diversity. So I'm getting at people are using the same word for different goals that still have to do with equality. For other people, diversity is about provision, to ensure sensitivity or responses or adequate provisions in terms of, like right now in the United States, there's a big debate about transgender toilets. A provision that is a way of accommodating diversity in terms of gender and sexuality and so forth. But it's about physical provisions or programs that can be created. Again, a different meaning altogether. In the business world, it's about, a lot of this diversity talk is about doing things that will enhance your competition against your other companies. So diversity is used a lot for public relations and for marketing to show what an open and progressive hiring practice you have, or you want to appeal to a particular customer base that itself is diverse, or you simply want to avoid lawsuits because you don't have a very good hiring strategy that hires people with lots of modes of difference and so forth. So it's important for your business competition to promote diversity. And then finally, another way that a lot of people talk about diversity these days is within particular groups and organizations. There's a lot of work in social psychology and elsewhere that shows that diverse teams that are made up with people with lots of modes of difference actually perform better, come up with better solutions, can solve problems better than homogeneous teams. And so that's another way of trying to promote diversity. So this is what I mean by polysemy. Even though there's a shared agenda of anti-discrimination and equality, the way that diversity is talked about can go in different directions for different purposes. All of them laudable, well, except maybe some of the business cases. But you see how even within diversity, there is confusion. Now, a lot of these things can overlap, and most often there's a great ambiguity as to what people are saying about promoting diversity. So let's say that, people have argued, we want more diversity in the American Academy Awards, in the Oscar. Well, are they just talking about they want more films made by Black people? They want better representation of Black people in films? They want more money towards films by Black filmmakers and so forth? Well, they probably mean all of those sorts of things, which are all, progressive, laudable intentions, but it's not clear sometimes what the actual goal is. So anyways, there's a polysemy around diversity. A lot of people have critiqued the notion of diversity by saying, it's just all about counting people who are different without doing anything about it. Or this is, I think, one of the worst critiques is it equalizes difference, that gender and race and sexuality and disability, well, they're all kind of like the same thing. They all function in the same way, and discrimination plays out in the same way, which is, of course, absolutely wrong. Sociologically, we can show that different modes of difference are experienced differently, and discrimination takes place differently. And then especially if you get into what's called intersectionality, the way that gender, sexuality, race, for instance, can combine, can create a different experience of discrimination in itself. But some people criticize all this diversity discourse by saying it makes all of these differences kind of equal. Or by just talking about diversity and getting more numbers in, it can take it out of politics to make a real difference in the way people live and the way inequality and stratification is played out. Or some people say that, particularly, let's say, in a university or a corporation, it's all just a performance, it's a facade, they don't really mean it. They can talk the talk of diversity and promoting it, but they don't really make any changes to their organization. And in the same way, some people say that all this talk of diversity doesn't really address inequality in its sake. Now, again, I would say that these critiques are sometimes justified, sometimes not justified, but it depends on the particular meaning of diversity that's being addressed. And I just showed in the previous slide that there are lots of different ways that people have talked about diversity. So sometimes these critiques are right, sometimes they're completely misappropriated. Okay, now what about in academia? Can there be such a thing as diversity studies? And even though I'll have to say, I was asked by a publisher to create a handbook of diversity studies, which I did as a kind of exercise, and said, well, what would diversity studies actually look like? And I said, well, one thing could be bringing together the study of these different modes of differentiation, how categorization works, how social interaction works, how power and inequality works when we're talking about race or gender or sexuality or disability or whatever it is. And putting those together side by side to look at the similarities and differences about how social difference works could be part of diversity studies. I also said that another aspect could be more of a sociological, anthropological, and political study of how complex social environments work, of when we have lots of different modes of social difference working together in a neighborhood or in a workplace. How does that actually work? What are the dynamics? How does stratification and inequality work? And this could be an interesting field of diversity studies, particularly through comparison of workplaces or countries or cities, of how this works. And I've recently written something there at the bottom where I kind of bring these together into a kind of model or agenda for how these might be studied together. But in the end, I still think that diversity is not a very good rubric or umbrella concept for social science research. A, because it's very ambiguous, as I've been talking about, and B, because it's used with this kind of political agenda in the public sphere, which I'm all for, but you see what I mean? If we're trying to study something which uses the same discourse and terminology as something that has a political agenda, it gets very confusing how to do social science of this. We could talk about this afterwards, but I have argued that diversity is not a very good analytical term or concept because of all these polysemy and ambiguity and differential uses of it. So superdiversity, which is the term I coined in 2007, which has kind of taken off and had a life of its own, is a different sort of term. And this is my argument, that whereas diversity is an important kind of political term or social agenda term, superdiversity, I argue, is a wholly, or should be used, in my reckoning, as a wholly social scientific, analytical, or descriptive term. Now, just in the last, I'll try to finish up in 10 minutes here. The reason I came up with this term was, this was back when I was at Oxford at this Compass Center, and we were getting all this data about migration flows. And I was looking at migration flows, particularly to the UK, but since then I've looked elsewhere around the world. And over the past 30 years, we've seen a big shift in migration flows. You used to have large flows from particular countries to particular countries, like Algeria to France, or Turkey to Germany, or Mexico to the US, or India and Pakistan to the UK. And what's happened over the last 30 years is you've had much smaller numbers of people coming from more countries and going to more countries. So there's great differentiation of migration flows, but also very different combinations of these sorts of variables that you see on the screen. So nationality, language, religion, legal status, particularly skills and human capital, have been combined in much more complex ways over the last 30 years to mark these migration flows. I'll talk about this more in a minute. So I came up with superdiversity, meaning it's not super in that it's more powerful or it's great or something, but that it supersedes earlier patterns of migration and population diversity. Here, there's the word again. That we've seen before. It's much more complicated and complex combinations of variables. So I've called that superdiversity, something above the earlier patterns that we had seen in migration traits. And particularly the way that the big key concept with superdiversity is the combinations of these variables. So we're looking at multivariable phenomena. Okay, and also for me, a big part of superdiversity has inherently to do with stratification. I talk about global migration as a great kind of sorting mechanism or filtering mechanism. That is, over the past 30 years, we've seen migrants increasingly channeled, put into different streams, particularly by way of these combinations of particular countries of origin coming into particular migration streams. So migration streams, we're talking about skilled laborers, unskilled laborers, asylum seekers and refugees, students, family migration, and multiple legal statuses that accompany all of these kinds of streams. Gender, age, human capital, as educational and other skills. We've seen groupings and, as I say, recombinations of these sorts of variables or traits. And because of the combinations of these things, so how a migration stream and its legal status combines with the country of origin and combines with gender, to locate people in highly differential positions in the countries in which they go to. So, some of the key examples we've got are, I showed how over the past 30 years, let's say if we're talking about Filipinos, how Filipino young female migrants are almost entirely located in the health service in the UK, and they get particular visas which restrict them from doing certain things in the UK. So that's, again, highly gendered, particular legal status, particular country of origin, particular set of human capital skills, and then positioned very specifically within the British labor market and within British geographies as well. So this is the kinds of examples that I mean. We've seen this more and more particular groups. Or high-skilled Indian computer experts going through particular channels to different countries like Germany or the United States or Canada or something. And given the parameters of their legal status, they get put into a very high stratified position and particular cities in which they go. So this combination of migration channel, of particular positions, social and economic positions into which they become located, and these have created new national and urban configurations, which again play out in different sorts of things: privilege and precarity, integration, and so forth. So again, a key idea, all of this is what I talk about as super diversity now, about how all these multivariables produce and reproduce certain modes of socioeconomic stratification by way of these migration streams. So as you say, as I'm pointing out, this is a social scientific concept and approach, which I think you should already see is very different from what I was talking about with diversity discourse. Okay. However, I have to say, even though I never intended it, superdiversity has been taken up and has become a public term like diversity. And this has made it confusing because different agencies, organizations, governments, municipal governments, education boards, here in Viva, there's something about the arts. This is INIVA is an organization that organizes and promotes culture in the arts, and they've talked about superdiversity in the visual arts. There you see, it has become a public term, and people have given it their own meanings to make it sound more like the kind of political agenda of diversity. And this was even a real kind of shock to me. We've literally, this was in Brussels, people literally marching behind a banner of superdiversity and calling for superdiversity and so forth. And this was never my intention. I intended it wholly as a social scientific concept, but it's, as I say, it's taken on a world of its own in a public sphere, and that's why we can get this confusion between diversity and superdiversity, the way that people have come to use it. Or even within the academic sphere, people have taken up superdiversity, and it's come to mean or been applied to quite different things from my original intention. And I wrote an article about this, and I think Alessandra put it on a reading list. People have talked about superdiversity simply to talk about more ethnicities, or to talk about global or urban conditions, or social formations, or something to do with identity or life world, or particularly in sociolinguistics, it's taken off in a huge way to look at very complex new modes of communication, and they talk about it as superdiversity. And you know, as I said, it's kind of like a genie escaped from a bottle, or the little devils escaped from Pandora's box, or something like that. It's being used in lots of different ways, but at least in academia, it has remained mainly a descriptive concept. And that was my original intention, even though now they're applying it to sociolinguistics and identity and all these sorts of things. So it's taken on this world, but I still try to push it as a wholly social scientific concept. And of course, because it's gotten popular and it's out there and used in lots of different ways, it's also attracted criticism. A lot of people, because it's been taken up in so many different places and is cited in so many thousands of journal articles and so forth, people don't like anything that they label as trendy or a buzzword or something, and so they're critical of it. They think it must be somehow ridiculous or lightweight or something like that because it's picked up in a lot of places, it's popular. Historians have criticized it because it talks a lot about new this and that, new modes of migration, new combinations, new urban environments, new configurations. And historians are quick to point out, well, we've had similar sorts of things in the past. And that's an interesting discussion to have. I'm not poo-pooing it. I would still hold that there is a lot of new things going on, but it's a worthwhile discussion to have with historians. Other people, critical race people or feminists and so forth, have said that it hasn't given enough attention to race or to gender or to power dynamics. Again, that's an interesting discussion to have, or that I have been having with a number of people over the years. Some people say it's a wholly Eurocentric concept because it started talking about London and Great Britain, and it's been taken up especially by a lot of European social scientists. But I would counter this to say, well, it's also been taken up and applied to places across Africa, across Asia, and Mexico and Latin America and so forth. So I would say it's not Eurocentric. And some people have associated with, well, superdiversity means happy diversity and everybody getting along. And again, I would say that's a complete misrepresentation because, as I pointed out earlier, my main concern is with social stratification and inequality and how super diverse configurations produce and reproduce inequalities and so forth. So it's not just about happy diversity. There's very unhappy things happening with super diversity as well. Okay, so this is the kind of conclusion now. Again, just kind of introductory to these two terms, and we go back to that original question, why are we talking about super diversity when we haven't yet sorted out diversity? It's a good question, but I hope you get the point that we're really talking about two different things. That diversity is this kind of small p political normative agenda, that we want more equality by way of different modes of difference. And therefore, diversity means we're calling for something. We have an agenda. We think things need to be made better. Whereas super diversity for me is this descriptive and analytical social scientific concept that doesn't have an agenda. It tries to remain just within a kind of theoretical overview of trying to describe certain new developments and new configurations and new combinations of data. It doesn't have this kind of normative agenda, even though, as we say, some people have taken it up to try to promote that. But as far as I'm concerned, I want to try to keep it in the realm of social science. I don't think these two should get mixed up. Okay, I hope that kind of introduction has helped. Happy to have a discussion and maybe keep some of these things in mind throughout the rest of the Cocumint series to see how this resonates or makes sense throughout the rest of it. And I hope it's helpful. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for this very rapid introduction, which has so many reflection behind, so many questions. In fact, the distinction between positive or negative diversity is the main issue. When we study about migration, the fact of innovation, diversity, or different country of origin, migrant has playing a very positive role, but as soon as we go to the society, to social life, diversity is perceived a problem, is perceived a complexity which has to be solved with policies, with intervention. I think the main diversity which is create problem is the communication. That means the understanding of the action of the other, which are frequently filtered through the culture of the country of origin, so misinterpreted. And this is not taking place also between different nationality, but also in the same country. If we have a large country like Italy, is what you call recognition. No? You consider somebody different because the communication is different. But I don't want to monopolize the floor. I know that Andrea has prepared a list of questions. So please, Andrea, if you want to go, switch on your microphone.
Okay, thank you so much for your intervention, first of all. It has been enlightening, as always. So I would try to start from a social scientific consideration and then move to a more political question. I read with attention your paper about diversity and social imaginary, and I found two interesting concepts, two interesting sentences I underlined, I highlighted. So the first is that diversity and diversification are linked, are strictly tied. And the second is that migration is in some way the vehicle through which diversity and diversification go hand in hand. Starting from these two sentences, I start reasoning about a political outcome of this. So my question is, do you think that in a European society, these dyads of diversity, diversification go hand in hand with social cohesion? And so that's my question. So thank you so much.
Yeah, no, I mean, you put your finger on one of the big issues. That policymakers as well as academics have been grappling with for a long time: how to ensure something called social cohesion.
Yeah.
In a context where you have diversity, superdiversity, diversification. And diversification now can also mean lots of different things. As you mentioned, as a migration scholar, I'm most interested in diversification that comes about through migration and all these combination of patterns that I've just laid out as superdiversity. But there's also diversification generationally, and that in many countries, one of the fastest growing categories are people from mixed backgrounds as well. And that's an important mode of diversification as well. And that if you look at age groupings, you have across Europe now much more diverse younger generations, people under 25 or so, than you do 25 to 40, and especially 50 to 70. And so you have diversification within populations as well as coming from outside. And, I get frustrated with a lot of social cohesion agendas. It's also wrapped up with the word integration as well. And of course, we want to ensure, this is where, again, um, just the way that between diversity and superdiversity, I was trying to make these distinctions between a kind of political or normative agenda. What kind of society do we want? How do we want to recognize diversity? And social science descriptive agenda. How does it actually work? What does it look like? The same thing goes between social cohesion and integration.
Yeah.
These can be normative terms, or social scientists can try to study what it actually looks like. Okay. And there's often these things don't meet, or because a lot of times when you have politicians and policymakers talking about integration and social cohesion, they're talking basically about kind of assimilation. And this is important for your discussions about culture as well. That they're talking about people becoming more like the Italians or something like that. And then all the presumptions that go along with that.
Yeah.
Whereas social scientists can study something that they call integration or social cohesion, and it doesn't entail everybody becoming the same. It talks about more and more equality in the labor market, or more equal educational attainment, or more everyday interactions and so forth. But you see how the same word can be used for very different meanings, sometimes normative, sometimes social scientific. So it's important you raise that. So, you know, it's typical. Basically what I'm getting at is a very typical academic response that rightly drives everybody crazy, but it's what we academics always say: it depends what you mean by by social cohesion.
Thank you so much.
Alessandra, may I ask a question?
Please do.
Yes. Thank you very much. It was very interesting, the presentation and the whole discussion about this super diversity notion that I was not very familiar with, coming from a cultural economics background. But indeed, I had some questions. Possibly are one, a clarification, and secondly, a question about how superdiversity can be related to somehow cultural policies. The first point is, my first question or need of clarification is if this superdiversity concept applies more to societies that have already experienced somehow second generation migrations, or only first generation migration. This is something maybe that it's just me that I'm not very aware of this sorry, of this phenomenon. But for example, in the works that we did with Alessandra, and considering also the Italian context, we found that there are surely differences between countries that are just experiencing the first, or migration of first generation, third generation migrants compared to second generation migrants in the country. The second point is if, in your opinion, superdiversity would be related to to more artistic creativity in a society, meaning that from my understanding of the notion that you have explained, superdiversity is actually could enable somehow a kind of cross-fertilization of and the emergence of subcultures. And I don't know whether you have an answer on this, but my question is, in your opinion, and from your experience in societies that are super diverse, do you think that this could be an enabling factor for spurring artistic creativity, even in a subcultural understanding? Or there are factors, for example, that hinder this artistic creativity? this is just a question that I don't know whether there can be an answer, a definite answer, but it's related to from a cultural policy perspective on what we are thinking also in the arts and cultural sector.
Yeah, no, thanks a lot, Enrico. These are really interesting questions. And what I would suggest, I'll try to give an answer as I can, but I would really urge you to write down and keep and ask the exact same questions to Marco Martiniello later on in the series, because he's actually written about a lot of the things that you're asking about, and he'll be able to provide a much better answer, because he uses the concept of superdiversity and he looks at cultural policy and cultural production in music and the visual arts and so forth. So he's great for that. But for my answer, which won't be as good as Marco's, no, you're absolutely right. Can we think about superdiversity in relation to the arts by way of looking at new modes of creativity or emergence of subcultures? And I would say yes, absolutely. And this is where I've learned, especially, I would try to equate it to some of the work that I know, in sociolinguistics that I've talked about. And sociolinguistics now are using the concept of superdiversity to talk about these new complexities and things that they're calling polysemiotic resources. That is the fact that a lot of people now have lots of different language repertoires that they're able to build up from lots of different languages that they've been exposed to, and everybody can speak a little bit of something, and people combine them now into really interesting ways. And especially on the internet, there's all sorts of sociolinguistic work about all these creative uses of language and combination of language and visual memes and so forth. And it's this kind of creativity. They also talk about translanguaging, about new languages developing that cross and don't belong to any particular language group. And so there are very creative things happening with language. And Marco, again, will point out how there are also very creative things happening because of these new combinations that superdiversity brings. People, with lots of different kinds of backgrounds in nationality and religion, gender, sexuality, their legal status, their class backgrounds, and so forth, combine in interesting sorts of ways. And I mean, you mentioned subculture. In Germany, and particularly in places like Berlin, they talk about particular scenes. So, the gay Jewish Kreuzberg scene or something like that is a kind of cultural grouping or place where certain kinds of artistic production and music and whatnot happen. And it's these recombinations and so forth that can go along with the notion of superdiversity. And I think that's probably where a lot of really interesting artistic production is happening. And I'm sure you probably know much more about it, is combinations and recombinations of things. Now, the difficult question becomes, and I remember hearing the talks by and talking with people in, cultural policy and so forth. The question is, when you have artists who are doing all of this creative work, but still get labeled as an African artist or a Nigerian artist, and that doesn't do any justice to all of the kinds of complexities behind these people. But sometimes they need that just to be promoted, and they quickly want to escape from that labeling. So I don't know, I would ask you how that works in the culture industry, that sometimes artists have to be labeled in order to be able to hit the public, and then they quickly want to get rid of the label because they see that you're talking about hindering activity. And I would think this kind of labeling is the biggest hindrance, and this labeling doesn't recognize the superdiversity of these scenes that are being created. I don't know what you think of that.
Yes, I think that got the point that is from a cultural policy perspective, this is actually the key issue because, well, in my question, I have not articulated all these justification for the question, but indeed, the point is that in cultural policy, both at the national or international level, thinking also, for example, how the debate on the protection of diversity has been framed is most of the time an approach based on trying to categorize artistic and cultural expressions and try to freeze them out and conserve them. And of course, this is something that neglects the dynamic evolution of artistic and cultural expressions that most of the time are the result of combination and mixing of different societies and traits of people. And in this case, so the problem is that it's quite difficult in cultural policy. Most of the time, the debate on cultural diversity and its protection is based on supporting existing expression without investing too much or recognizing even the new creative energies that can generate new expression, but at the expenses of the old ones. There's no solution. I mean, this is the tension that in cultural policy occurs. There is a lot of literature on the two different positions. But of course, I mean, this is a point of interest because one related question that I would say or comment I would say. Is super diversity something that has to be protected or not? Is it because it addressed the dynamic evolution of the groups of societies of traits is something that has to be more accepted as a dynamic process? I mean, and we don't need cultural policies, for example, to trigger them. This is just a food for thought.
Yeah, no, it's good food for thought, because I could only give an answer for thought, something in that as well. But just wanted to say that, that your response was really helpful, and I can just imagine that in cultural policy, there's this real conundrum. Like I said, there's probably a lot of calls for more diversity in the arts of whatever kind, visual arts, music, etc., performance arts. Just like, I use this example all the time, the Academy Awards, that's part of the arts, filmmaking. So to call for more diversity is an important thing in all those ways I talked about, equality, fairness, anti-discrimination, and that entails, getting people in as Black artists or Black women artists or something, let's say. But then, that's the question. Do you just stop there? And how do you avoid tokenism? That's why I say, I've talked to these artists who say that they need that label, and it's a good thing to promote more diversity, but they quickly want to get rid of that label, and they want to be recognized as an artist and not just as a Black artist or an African artist or Arab artist or whatever it is. And so that's the kind of conundrum. You need diversity, but then you don't want to just rely on diversity. You want to rely on talent as well. And that's what a lot of the discussions around the Academy Awards, I think, are as well. Not that I hugely follow it. Now, and then maybe just a final thing, I don't know, before we close, is super diversity something to be protected? Well, I would say no, because my whole view of it is about how inequality and social stratification is formed. And a lot of super diversity dynamics, these migration flows, insert a lot of people at the very bottom end of the society. So, the creation of asylum seeker, refugee, or, sans papier people, undocumented, is part of a super diversity dynamic because of the way that legal systems are made and because of the countries people are come from and so forth. So that's something you don't want to preserve. I think I would say is super diversity is something that needs to be recognized as to how particular migration flows, particular migration streams and legal statuses affect people's lives. And actually, coming back to the earlier question, actually impede integration and social cohesion because people are restricted because of their legal status or to where they're inserted in the economy and labor market and so forth. So certainly not to be protected, but should be recognized that this is how social structure is evolving. Oh, can't hear us, Andrew.
I have a last comment. I would like your comment on this. I'm always surprised to see that the world, there is always more mobility. Italy was a very homogeneous country. Migration in Italy started in the 90s. At the beginning, there was a benevolent attitude toward the migrants because Italians have been migrants for a long time. At the beginning, there was the idea that they wanted to provide to the migrant the rights that the Italian had after a long time when they migrated abroad. So at the beginning, in the 90s, there was this feeling. Little by little, migration increased, and the expectation is that if you have a country which is becoming much more international, so you don't have just one minority, let us say Moroccans, because at the beginning the flow after the Albanian came, but now we have Romanian, Ukrainian, we have people coming, Chinese, we had also before Chinese, we have people coming from many countries of origin, and also the Italian has learned to move a lot because with now the student with the Erasmus program, they go abroad, they study abroad, they become more international. This changing, I'm not saying that we become like the United States, a melting pot, people come from all over the world. I would expect a more tolerant attitude versus the people that are diverse. And this is not taking place in Italy, but taking place in Europe. All this populist movement growth. So I'm an economist, you know, so economists are poor-minded person. They want to find the solution number. So they say that if diversity increase at the beginning has a positive effect, when it reach a given threshold which is not just the share of migrant, 10%, but the composition of migrant. And for that reason, we studied the linguistic distance. That's main. Romanian, that have a culture similar to the Italian, create less reaction, and while is that the others. So I'm very surprised by the growth of this nationalist movement which are against migration. And I wonder if we should write 50%, so the share instead of migrants, instead of being 10%, should be grow so much that the identity of the country will decline. So this is something that for me is difficult because it's the behavior of society. This is your field, not mine. No? But on the other hand, it's not only the penetration into the labor market, because, for instance, Romania now, they will be the future of generation of Italians. They are employed, and so on. So, but you see among the migrants the same feeling versus other minorities. So this mechanism, which is more a society mechanism, instead of providing a more open vision, a more open approach to the others, is creating the rise of this populist movement, which are exactly going to the past, not to the future, going to the old tradition. a research of the city which is made only by one ethnicity or one standard family. So how you help me to understand?
Yeah, thanks, Don. I mean, these are the huge issues. I can't give an absolute solution because I ask the same questions. What's going on with all this populism and whatnot? But one thing that I would point out, I'll try to be quick because I know we should end, that I think it's important to look at a couple of other things. I mean, you mentioned about, you know, the share of the population and the composition of the population and so forth. I would say that it's important not only to look at the national level is one thing, to look at a differentiation around countries, and also to look at the rate or the pace of what I would call diversification. And what I mean by this is that, by example, if you look at the vote for Brexit in Britain, and we know that for a lot of people, the vote for Brexit was about immigration. They wanted to get out of the EU because they thought the EU meant more migrants coming to the UK.
The Polish migrant.
Yeah, exactly. And you saw that the places that voted for Brexit most were the places not with the most migrants. They actually voted to stay. So places like London and Manchester and so forth. It was smaller places that had diversified very quickly. So that places where maybe for a long time you had one or two migrant groups or something, and suddenly within the space of 6 or 10 years, you had 10 or 12 different ethnic groups. And there's something about rapid diversification that kind of freaks people out, and they go for this populist thing. So, and we know that cities are different from countryside, but even, I don't think it's even that simple. I'm just thinking of work being done by one of an Italian researcher, Elisa Lanari, at our institute, who looks at diversification in small places. She looks at these places up north of Veneto in the mountains, and even though it's a Liga Nord area, you have very welcoming local villages and towns who welcome asylum seekers and so forth. So there's all kinds of dynamics going on there, and these were places that, as you pointed out, never had migrants before. So some people react negatively, some people in a welcoming way, and we don't fully understand the dynamics. But I think pace or rate of diversification is one of the things that we have to look at, and how people react to that. Yeah. Okay.
So, if we don't have other questions, I would like to thank, on behalf of everybody, Stephen Vertovec for this fantastic lesson. Thank you very much. We will remain in contact with you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody. Have fun with the rest of the series. Yeah, thanks, then.